You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody listening, and welcome to Common Descent, a podcast about paleontology, evolution, natural history, and so on. This is episode 198, and it's a fish episode.
Fish.
This episode's topic is eels. We have not done very many fish episodes previously on the podcast, so it's very exciting to come back to a group of fish, especially eels, which are an extremely cool group of fish.
They really are.
But of course, one of the reasons that we don't do a lot of episodes about fish is because neither one of us knows all that much about fish.
Yeah.
Outside of Will and his aquarium experience and being the ocean guy on the podcast.
Yup.
We've been talking for a while about trying to get a fish guest on the podcast, and this is that episode. For the main discussion, to teach us about eels, we will be joined by Shay Maden, who is in fact a returning guest. The longest distance between first and second appearance of a guest we've ever had. Shay was on the podcast 7 years ago.
Yep.
So we are extremely happy to have Shay joining us to teach us all about eels. We will talk about what makes eels eels. We'll talk about some of the things that are called eels, but maybe aren't true eels. And we'll talk about the fossil record of eels. We'll talk about evolutionary trends. We'll talk about why this body shape is beneficial. It's a whole cool conversation.
Yeah. No, I was very excited leading up to recording this just because eels are a group I've always been fascinated by. But if you asked me to explain eels, I wouldn't be able to.
Yes. Well, and I learned in the course of this discussion, as you'll hear, that they are even more snaky than I realized they were. Which makes this a great episode, in my book. We chose eels in part because they're very cool fish, and in part because Shay identified them as one of her favorite groups to talk about, but also they were requested a bunch. This topic for an episode was requested by Adrian, Glaive, Jack, Timmy, Clancy, Amy, Josh and Maria, Vivek, Icy, The Load, and Science Skink.
Woo! Nicely done, everyone. Good episode request.
That's a fittingly long list of names.
Which one of you are the secret jaws?
Who's that? One of those people? One of those people is the second set of jaws inside there. Thank you to everybody who requested this episode. Thank you to everybody who listens. And thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon. We always like to make mention of the fact that we have a Patreon, which supports the podcast, allows us to do all of our science educational things, thanks to the generous support of the people who are joined us on there. Subscribers to our Patreon got all sorts of goodies, including bonus content. We do live streams with patrons. There's a bunch of prizes. Well, they're not prizes, but good merch stuff you can get. Shirts and stickers and buttons and things like that. And at a certain level, when you join us on Patreon, we will shout your name out on the podcast. This episode, we would like to shout out new patrons, Alice, Kitsune, and geologist Jonathan.
Welcome. Thank you so much for supporting us.
Thank you so very much. Hey, listener, if you would like to join us on Patreon, you can find links in the episode description and come on over, get goodies, and help us do this thing that we enjoy doing and that you presumably enjoy listening to.
Yeah.
It is now August. This summer's Croc and Snake Month is over. We said this last time. Thanks to the generous support of our patrons, we were able to donate $1,500 to croc, snake, and turtle conservation organizations. And that was matched entirely by our friends at Mayflower Enterprises. So a huge thanks to all of our patrons, all of our supporters and listeners, and to Mayflower one more time for allowing us to contribute meaningfully to conservation efforts out in the world beyond just talking about these cool animals.
Yeah, we also got a thank you letter or a letter celebrating how well it went from them in the mail. So it went so well. So glad that they were able to, they participated and made it even more awesome.
That actually reminds me, we also got an email from Dr. Marissa Tellez, who is in charge of the Crocodile Research Coalition and who was joined us as a guest for Croc and Snake Month a couple of years ago, not only thanking us for the donation, which was very kind of her to do, but letting us know that this donation comes just in time for some new educational initiatives that they're starting up in that region for people who live in areas with crocodilians, learning to live alongside them. So it's great. This apparently it was a very timely donation as well.
Yeah, and we've said this. We said this a number of times because we said it on like Patron stuff and live streams, but just it went so well and it felt so good to be able to really make some decent donations to those plates. So like, thanks everyone for making it such an incredible Croc and Snake Month.
Yes, there are also some things coming up. With Croc and Snake Month out of the way, we are now thinking about this year's Spooky. We'll probably announce the theme for this year's Spooky maybe next episode. Let's do that next episode.
Working on the notes.
Also, the episode after next episode is episode 200 of Common Descent, which is a preposterous milestone. And to celebrate it, we will be doing that episode on the most requested topic in the history of the podcast. Not going to tell you what it is, but that's something to look forward to. And finally, shortly after this episode comes out, at the end of August, beginning of September, we will be returning to Dragon Con in Atlanta, Georgia. So if you're going to be at Dragon Con, come check us out. We are doing a bunch of panels and stuff this year. I'm going to list them out quickly. I'm not going to give you the times, just the names and the days. On Friday, we are, one or both of us, will be present at 3 panels, which are called One of Each Pokemon versus a Billion Lions. Is It a Dinosaur? That's a video game themed one. And The Mating Habits of Kaiju and Other Fantasy Creatures. It's going to be a great day.
Yep.
On Saturday, we've got a panel called Mammoth Tusks and Giant Beavers. That's this year's paleontology panel. Very exciting. And we'll be doing the hands-on science room with activities and stuff.
Yes.
Sunday, we've got a speculative evolution panel, a panel called Teeth, the second set. Will's going to be on the Teeth panel. And
very excited.
Science versus movies. Always thrilled to be on Science versus movies. Very exciting. And then finally, on Monday, we are on a panel about convergent evolution called Crabs, Trains, and Trees, which will also be a whole ton of fun. So we've got a whole bunch of cool stuff going on this year's Dragon Con.
Yeah, I'm excited for just all of it. It's going to be so good. So that absolutely come and say hi and let us know how your Dragon Con's going.
Yes, we will have goodies. We will have cool goodies to pass out. We always like to do that. Them's the announcements, which means it is time to talk about the news. Every episode, we like to pull some news from the world of paleontology, evolution, natural history, etc. Keeps us all up to date on what's happening in the realm of science. Will, if you would please, give us one, for now, news.
Fair enough. My news will be on dog brains. Specifically, the fact that it has long been noted that domesticated dogs have smaller brains compared to their wolf ancestors, and that this has been pointed as a side effect of domestication. This study wanted to see is it really unique to domestication? Is their brain size truly able to be associated solely with the fact that they were domesticated? This research is by Laszlo Zsolt Garamzegi and Nicholas Colm in Biology Letters, and the article is a press release in Eureka Alert. So domestication, we've talked about this on the podcast before, is when we breed an animal to better fit our way of life and our needs for that animal or plant.
Yes, episode 27.
Yes. In this case, in the case of animals, it's often been noted that domesticated animals have reduced brain size to their non-domesticated counterparts, their ancestors that they were domesticated from. This is particularly notable in domestic dogs, who have a notably smaller brain than gray wolves, the animal that we domesticated to turn into dogs. And it's often been considered, domestication as a phenomena as one of the most extreme forms of causes for brain size reduction. That it is a tool of that, basically, because of how consistent and how notable it is. This has been considered to be due to a number of potential reasons. relaxed pressures on the animal now that they're living with humans, that they basically may not need a big brain since they're no longer foraging for themselves. They're not having to compete for mates because we're selecting their mates for them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not having to avoid predators because they live in human society, which is one of the safest places on the planet because we kill everything that could kill us or our pets. And that the brain is a very metabolically costly organ. It takes a lot of energy to run a brain. That
Yes.
most of our calories go to our brain a lot of the time when we're using it, and it costs a lot.
Yes, episode 121.
If you don't need to use all that energy for a big brain, why not have a smaller brain? This study wanted to determine, is it truly a unique reduction in brain size? Is there something special about domestication, or do dog brains fall within the brain size categories of other canids? Are other canine relatives having similar brain size reduction compared to their relatives or other groups? And is domestication truly a unique case? So they wanted to look at it from a phylogenetic context. So they were looking at canids in general. They looked at brain to body size data for 25 canid species, including a number of ancient dog breeds that should have been closer to what the ancestral domesticated dog was like.
Episode 94 for All About Canids.
They ran this through statistical analysis to figure out what was the spread of brain to body sizes in the groups and find, is it what they called a evolutionary singularity? Is it truly a one-off unique situation, or are there others that it's basically the same as? And what they found is it doesn't seem to be particularly notable. It seems to fall within a number of other groups that had similar brain to body size ratios as domestic dogs, and therefore went through similar brain reduction sizes to what we would consider like a more average size. So domestication doesn't seem to have done anything that other evolutionary situations have already done. It doesn't seem to have done anything different than they did.
Yeah, so either this isn't necessarily related to domestication, or it is, but it's just something that happens in canines otherwise.
Or maybe domestication is just less of a cause than we were attributing it to.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 50% of the reason their brain is that size, but there's other factors that normally happen in canids that could cause this. They did note that there does seem to be a one-off situation. The hibernating common raccoon dog does have a pronounced outlier situation with their brain to body size. They do seem to be unusually have a reduced brain size, and they think that it could be the fact that it's a hibernating canid, which is not the common among canids. And hibernation is a time period where you want reduced energy costs and you have reduced food availability, which could also drive for a smaller, less metabolically costly brain. But it also highlights the fact that there are other things than domestication that can cause extreme brain reduction in a canid. So all of this seems to point to that domestication, it might not be wholly innocent in their smaller brains, but shouldn't be labeled as the be-all, end-all of why their brain is the size it is, and that it is some magic situation, some majorly unique situation in canid evolution for causing this feature. It seems like there's probably a lot of other factors that we should consider, and they noted that we might have just been coming at it from a bit too anthropocentric, human-focused view on what we did to dogs instead of looking at dog evolution in general.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can see, it's very easy to look at something like domestication and say, well, domestication is a very extreme phenomenon among evolution and among lineages. So it makes sense to see something unusual in a domesticated group and go, oh, that must be something related to domestication. Also, interestingly, to note that you mentioned earlier, this brain reduction is something that has also been noted in other domesticated species.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to see, is this also the case in other species? Are there other domesticated lineages that also are not unique in having small brains, are smaller than their relatives? And if so, is there something about the domestication process that mirrors the situations in nature where we're seeing this, like with the hibernating dogs. Is this a reduced need for more brain power, or a reduced availability of the reserves and the fuel to power a brain like that? Are we unintentionally simulating certain types of lifestyles that you do see in other species? That's really interesting.
Yeah, it'd also be cool if we looked at those other domesticated groups and found, is there a varying degree that domestication was or wasn't as much like maybe in dogs it's only part of the equation, but then for cows it's 70 or 80% of the equation. Right. No, it really does seem like we did something weird, like we caused a weird scenario with cows. That would be very cool to find out. Maybe domestication behaves differently, so to speak, in different groups.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that that's true. Cool. Well, speaking of wild relatives of domesticated species, I've got news about giant beans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're talking about plants. This is
magic
pretty
beans?
good stuff. Well, listen, they're fossils, so magic famously doesn't fossilize, so they could be.
Yeah, it's expired, whatever magical effect it had.
Magic breaks down very quickly once it's like DNA. It just starts falling apart. Yep. This is research by Edward Spagnuolo et al. In the International Journal of Plant Sciences, and we will link in the blog post, where you can find all of these links, to a press release in phys.org from Matthew Carroll at Penn State University. These researchers are describing fossil beans, which are fossil seeds. Episode 165, Allie taught us all about fruit. You can go there for how to differentiate beans from seeds from fruits, etc. These are fossil seeds from southeastern Asia that come at a time and place that is notable, not only because we don't have a lot of information about this time period in this region, but also it was a time of much movement of wildlife. In the modern region, Southeast Asia and the West Pacific, there are rainforests which owe their diversity to tectonic activity. A lot of the diversity seen in those rainforests in that region isn't all lineages that just have been there for millions and millions of years and developed into their current diversity. A lot of it is groups of life that moved over from somewhere else. There are two major tectonic moments that are largely responsible for that diversity today. One is when India collided with the rest of Asia, episode 119. The other is where two regions called Sahul and Sunda met as the Australian plate moved into the Southeast Asian plate. This collision began around 20 million years ago and resulted in a major exchange of life moving across these two landmasses. Similar to what we talked about in episode 43, when North and South America became connected, you have a whole interchange of life. Based on fossil and modern evidence, there are lots of plants that we have good reason to understand are currently in Asia because they moved over from the Australian region when this connection came together. But we don't know very much about examples of the opposite direction, about plants and animals that moved, and particularly plants that moved from Asia towards Australia. Part of this is because there's just not a lot of good plant fossils in these relevant parts of Southeast Asia, particularly in the Malay archipelago. This is a region with lots of rainfall and lots of dense vegetation, which makes it difficult to collect fossils if they even are there anymore after being churned up by plant roots.
Yeah.
So this limits what we understand about this interchange at this time. This new study describes plant macrofossils from a coal mine in the Tanjung Formation of Borneo, dating to the mid to late Eocene, somewhere between 34 and 40 million years ago. This is nicely within that Southeast Asian Malay archipelago region before the Sahul-Sunda exchange. So a snapshot of what plants were present at that time before that collision happened. They describe over 40 leaves and 2 pollen samples with lots of different types of plants preserved in them. But the main focus of the discussion is 3 giant seeds.
That's even the number that he got for the cow.
Listen, maybe. And then he went up and he got a giant and he said, can you pull Australia over closer to Asia so that I can go over there and sell my remaining 2 beans? Altogether, these seeds and other plant remains indicate a freshwater coastal swamp environment, but even more exciting than that, the seeds are a new species.
Cool.
The seeds, again, beans, are heart-shaped and quite large, up to 72 millimeters long, which is almost 3 inches, which is pretty big for a seed. The authors suggest that these likely, based on the kind of plant that it is, these likely grew in pods with several seeds, and the pods might have been up to 3 feet long.
Nice.
Big ol' seed pods.
Man, trying to snap those beans would be a workout. Nice.
I mentioned episode 165 for fruit, episode 135 for seeds, so go listen to Allie talk about plants a bunch. The seeds are identified as belonging to legumes, which was why we're calling them beans, a genus and species named Jantungspermum gunnelii, closely related to the modern genus Castanospermum, which is the Australian black bean tree. This is a type of tree that is today found in coastal rainforests in northern Australia and some nearby islands. This is an exciting find as beans go. These are the oldest known legumes in the Malay Archipelago region at over 35 million years old, and the only known fossil relatives of the Australian black bean trees today, which suggests these trees had ancient relatives up there in Southeast Asia, which could indicate that this lineage started in Asia and moved into the Australian region when this tectonic collision happened. A rare example of fossil evidence for a move in the other direction compared to a lot of the plants that we understand moved into Asia.
Nice.
These are also among the largest known fossil angiosperm seeds. The authors describe in the paper that large seeds are often dispersed by animals or by water. Australian black bean seeds disperse over water, so it's likely that these plants also did that, and their larger size might mean that they were adapted for traveling longer distances. They might have even been marine dispersing, like actually floating on ocean currents and stuff.
That like coconuts do today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which also famously large seeds.
Yep.
So, these plants provide a window into the ecosystem in the Malay Archipelago before that tectonic connection. There are other fossils in the same area, including invertebrate burrows, turtle fossils, and bird tracks, which is very exciting because the authors point out we don't have a ton of information about the evolution of tropical ecosystems, especially in Southeast Asia, because those are places where there's just not a lot of fossil evidence that has been found thus far. So this is a really exciting addition to our knowledge of what has happened in that region and how it was impacted when the Australian plate moved up to meet the Asian plate.
Very cool. It's always it's always one of the coolest aspects of the fossil record to me is how it helps us map out the interactions of land masses and understand the story of how things have been shuffled around on our planet. And then, how as those moved, that caused shuffling of organisms to move across to new areas. Very cool.
Yeah, well, if you like that, you're going to love my second news. Just wait.
All right, cool. I'm ready for it.
You go first.
All right, I will. My next news is also about something that was marine dispersed because it's a marine croc.
Okay.
And this is a new genus and species of marine croc that is very well preserved. This research is by Sven Sachs et al. In the Journal of Systematic Paleontology, and the article is by Enrico de Lazaro in Sci News. This is a metriorhynchid crocodilomorph We talked about those in our Marine Crocs episode.
Episode 168.
These were the truly fully marine adapted Crocs. They had flippers for limbs. They had a tail fin. They smooth, scaleless skin. They no longer were covered in bumpy skin with osteoderms and stuff. They were very much dolphin Crocs in the way, or mosasaur-esque Crocs.
Yeah. Technically, I guess they were ichthyosaur-esque Crocs because
that's
they
true.
predate mosasaurs.
Yep. Well, it's like how we always call things Croc shape, but then point out that the Crocs were actually the third one to get to that shape. So
Yes.
These are well known from the Jurassic and are in the Cretaceous, but the fossils are much rarer. So they seem to be kind of trailing off into the Cretaceous. This specimen is from the lower Cretaceous of Germany, dating to around 140 to 132 million years ago in shallow sea fossil deposits, and is the most complete and well-preserved Cretaceous metriorhynchid skull that we have thus far, and making it one of the more recent members of the group since it's in the Cretaceous. So very interesting and useful for being able to understand how this group was doing and what they were looking like in the later stages of their time span. This new genus and species is Inaliotes schroederi. Now, this is not a new specimen. This specimen was actually discovered over 100 years ago. So it's a specimen we've known about, but it hadn't been in its own genus until this study. It had been put into previous groups. Inaliosuchus, which was, I think, is another genus found in the similar deposits. More recently, it was Cricosaurus. So it's been moved around. It got a new taxa with this more recent study because they did a CT scan to get a really good look at the features inside the skull, because it is also one of our only 3D preserved metriorhynchid skulls.
Ooh.
So not only is it a good complete skull, it is not crushed and smushed. So we can get a look at the inner cavities and features, and that allowed them to find enough distinct features that said this is a unique genus.
Yeah, this species doesn't actually belong to those other groups that we had thought that it might. It is, in fact, its own thing.
It had some interesting features, lots of little specific things on measurements and features that often come up when a new species is determined that are very technical, and only people who study these groups will know what those mean.
Right, very specific, like proportions of different skull bones and the way that this bone attaches to this bone, all unique little bits.
This thing usually has 3 bumps. It only has 2. That's unique enough to, stuff like that. It can be very particular.
Yes. These 2 bones normally don't touch underneath the orbit, but in this one, these 2 bones actually do touch underneath the orbit. That kind of stuff.
The abstract lists a bunch of those and everything, but it did note some unique ones that I was able to. I can actually give you some info on what that means. It lacks the bulbous feature of the nasal cavity, which we talked about a bit in the Marine Crocs episode, that has often been looked at as potentially where their salt glands would be. So it might have something different going on there. That's a very characteristic feature of metriorhynchid Crocs. It also has some things that might give implications for what the group overall was doing going into the Cretaceous. They note that, we see them become marine in the Jurassic and become, more and more marine as time goes on, as you expect with a land to marine group, that they slowly give up land features and take on more aquatic features. And it seems with some of the features of this croc that continued for the group into the Cretaceous. It has even larger eyes, which is a feature already characteristic for this group, but it has unusually large eyes for metriorhynchids. And its inner ears are more compact, which seemed to be a sign that it was a fast swimmer. So it seems like this was that they were continuing to become, more quote unquote specialized, or at least continuing to specialize for ocean life in ways. So the group was, it's likely that our Cretaceous metriorhynchids were even more marine croc than we typically think of, since most of our fossils come from the Jurassic.
Yeah. That's cool, and it follows a trajectory that we often see in extinct groups like this. We've talked about this with dinosaurs and stuff, that it is often easy to assume what this group went extinct because they were on the way out or the environment changed and they couldn't keep up, so they must not have had the right adaptations or whatever. But this could be one of those examples of, no, this group was still doing quite well and was still adapting further and further specializations or adaptations for their lifestyle, but other factors got in the way. They weren't a failing group because of their own adaptations necessarily. There may have been changes that were too big or competitors or something that drove them ultimately to extinction. To say, well, like we've talked about with dinosaurs, where the extinction of the dinosaurs happens at a time that is arguably the most successful and biodiverse time in the history of dinosaurs.
Absolutely. That it's always important to remember that extinction isn't just about winners and losers in the evolutionary race, but random happenstance on the planet Earth, and that sometimes the cards just don't fall your way. And had they happened differently, your group probably could have gone to be extremely successful for a long time. But things just didn't land the way they needed to for that to happen, and that group ended up disappearing. So yeah, it was fun to think about. It got me thinking of like, yeah, what would Metriorhynchids look like today, or into the Cenozoic had they survived?
Yeah.
Would we have whale crocs that were
big
just
baleen, filter feeding whale crocs?
Would they just be super, super unrecognizable if you compared it to a normal croc then?
Yeah.
Because they had gone so extremely marine.
So fun stuff to think about.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the ocean, my last bit of news here is about a geologic record that documents the phases of the opening of the southern Atlantic Ocean.
Oh, hey, that is what we were talking about.
It is. Now, this is the other direction. My last news was about continental masses coming together. This is about them splitting apart. This is research by Lewis Jacobs et al. In the Geological Society London Special Publications, and we will link to yet another press release in SciTech Daily from Southern Methodist University. The Atlantic Ocean used to not exist. So at the start of the Mesozoic era, we had Pangaea, supercontinent, episode 141. And then over the course of the Mesozoic era, Pangaea starts to break apart. And one of the ways that it breaks apart is right down the middle.
Yes.
And the western continents move west and the eastern continents move east. And in the space between them is what is now the Atlantic Ocean. This split begins in the Jurassic into the Cretaceous majorly. South America and Africa start to split apart from each other in the early Cretaceous around 140 million years ago. If I remember correctly, it's one of the last parts of the Atlantic Ocean to open is this space between South America and Africa.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of information about how this happened from marine sediments and seismic data and fossil distributions and stuff. But generally, that information is coming from a bunch of different places, scattered different types of evidence in the geologic record. This study reports on geologic deposits in Angola that record the whole thing.
Ooh.
Which is very cool. So Angola, for those of you who don't know where Angola is, of course, I knew. I didn't have to look it up on a map and find out where Angola is.
And I know, but for the listeners, please be specific.
Absolutely. Angola is located on the west coast, the Atlantic coast of Africa. It's sort of just underneath the bulbous part of the top of Africa.
All right.
So where Africa kind of extends out in the nook. It's sort of right there, just underneath the nook. This paper describes several geologic outcrops in Angola along the shoreline that include rocks and fossils that document different phases of the South Atlantic opening. These geologic outcrops range from around 130 million years ago, which is around the time that the opening begins, to around 70 million years ago, far later. And from oldest to youngest, these rocks document different phases of the opening.
That's awesome.
The oldest of these rocks are volcanic in nature. They are the remains of lava that came up during rifting. So as continental landmasses begin to split, they thin and you tend to get magma and lava bubbling up from underneath. In this case, forming a large igneous province.
It's back.
It's back. It's back. It always comes back. It can never, it's always lurking just under the surface, waiting to emerge. Specifically, this is the Etendeka-Paraná large igneous province. After that, younger rocks have carbonate deposits, which were deposited in the basin that is now forming as these landmasses pull apart. Then salt deposits, which were formed during the evaporation of shallow and, in some places, impermanent ocean water as an ocean is beginning to be established. And then finally, youngest rocks with fossils of ichthyosaurs and mosasaurs and sea turtles in them, which are marine reptiles, which suggest that a proper channel of ocean had at that point emerged between Africa and South America.
Nice. That's cool.
They point out that this arguably comprises the most complete terrestrial exposed geologic record of continental movement. So just a lovely record of this process. And in the press release, one of the authors is quoted as saying, "It's one thing for a geophysicist to be able to look at seismic data and make inferences from that. It's another thing to be able to take a field trip out to the rock formations and say, this is where the lava was spreading, and this is where it was a continuous land. This is when the ocean had moved into this place." So this is a really cool one place you can go to study this process.
That's so awesome. It's just picturesque.
It's exactly what you want as a geologist.
It's like when you look in books and they have the picture to explain sedimentary layers, and they'll have like our shirts from the museum,
yes,
that have the different layers on it. When you see those examples, those are useful for teaching. But then you also have that caveat of like that's not actually what you're going to find when you go to a rock outcropping.
Right.
Typically,
like these rocks are over there, and these rocks are over there, and these rocks are correlated from another country.
And typically stories like this have to be pieced together in a similar way of we have evidence from this time period over here, and then 2 countries away, we have this time period after that here, and then over on the other side of the rift on South America, we have this part of the story. So usually you have to piece it together just because, getting
this
just
is
such
a bunch of outcrops along the shoreline of one country.
Yeah, just like this textbook ideal situation. It doesn't come up often. We shouldn't expect it, but when it happens, it's beautiful. That's
they
so
also,
cool.
In the paper, they also talk a bit about the concept of geoheritage, that this makes the Angola coastline and these, several locations with these outcrops a key part of the natural history, the natural landscape, and the scientific informative value of this region. And that this is the kind of thing that regions get officially designated for as, heritage sites or like UNESCO sites we've talked about before, that like this means that the country of Angola, here is a new thing for the country of Angola to be proud of within their geography, is these extremely unusual, great rocks that record this geologic phenomenon.
Absolutely. I would be ecstatic if that was found where I live. That's so cool.
Congratulations to all of our Angolan listeners.
Yes.
I don't know. Hey, listen, if you are a listener who is Angolan, please message us.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know if Angola has ever shown up on our stats specifically. So all 4 of the people who listen from Angola can message us and tell us. I think maybe way more than that. Who knows?
Yeah. Go. You can jump in our Discord and brag about the cool rocks.
Yeah, you brag about your cool rocks. Absolutely. Well, this news has just been full of talking about ocean stuff. We talked about marine
Yeah.
crocs and other marine reptiles and the splitting of oceans and stuff. But that segues us nicely into talking about an even more specialized group of aquatic animals. Indeed, a group that never left the ocean to begin with.
they're dedicated ocean out. You know, they
They're the
didn't
OG.
have to. Yeah, they didn't leave it for a time. You know, they've been with it all the way through.
That's right. After this short musical interlude, we will get into our main discussion talking about eels with special guest and paleoichthyologist Shay Maden. Stay tuned. Hello, Shay.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you for an episode about fish.
Fish.
Yes, my pleasure.
This is normally a place where I would be inclined to say welcome to the podcast, but in your case, indeed, welcome back to the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Longtime listeners may recall that Shay was our guest 7 years ago.
Yeah.
On episode 13. You were one of our guests in the prep lab.
Back when I was a little baby paleontologist.
Yep.
That was a long time ago. In the interim, since that recording, you have become a paleoichthyologist.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, we've done a few fish episodes, but
Mhm.
we're just not good at fish.
Yeah. There's a lot of them, and they lack a lot of the vertebrate things that we usually would be talking about.
Mm-hmm. Like limbs.
Yeah, like limbs. Those are
Differentiated teeth.
Yeah. Yep.
Bones that we can identify.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They don't just feel like they've been copy and pasted through the body.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, glad to have you.
Absolutely. Before we get into our topic of eels, if you would please, for the benefit of our listeners, introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Shay Maden, and I'm a paleontologist, a caver, a naturalist. I'm currently serving through AmeriCorps at the Gray Fossil Site and Natural History Museum in Northeast Tennessee. And currently, a lot of my research focuses on specifically North American freshwater fish, mostly fossil. I've got a couple of projects going on living fishes, and then also on cave fauna, so both living animals that we find in caves in the Southeast today, and fossil assemblages from these caves, what they can tell us about how climate and topography and watersheds have changed, mostly through the late Pleistocene, but also further back in time.
Getting to study both cave fossils and cave animals is pretty. That's a pretty double awesome. Very cool.
Well, it's a lot of fossils, and then it's also a lot of bugs. It's like, amphipods
Yes.
and isopods, and a little less glamorous than the actual big fossils, but they're still fun.
Our listeners have heard us talk about the Gray Fossil Site a whole bunch. That is how we know Shay, having worked together at the museum. When I approached you about doing a fish episode, I actually showed Shay some of the different fish episodes that have been requested.
Yes.
And we settled on eels, which is a fantastic choice. I'm very excited to learn about eels. So to get us into that discussion, could you please briefly, the next hour will be the long version of this, but briefly, what is an eel?
It's a long fish. I mean, I think that's about the shortest answer that you can get. We're going to focus specifically on what are called the true eels, which is the order Anguilliformes. But pretty much every fish that is called an eel is just a fish that is rather elongate in body form.
Yeah.
And usually slimy.
Oh yeah. That makes sense. That is a kind of a trend they have.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have...
Mostly scaleless.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I guess that's true.
Mm-hmm.
They're scaleless fish.
Smooth.
We have already exhausted most of the information that I know about eels.
Yep.
So this is going to be great.
Yep.
So let's talk then about what you have called the true eels, the Anguilliformes. What are they? What distinguishes the true eels?
Well, specifically, these are bony fishes. So they're not cartilaginous. They actually have an osseous skeleton. They are ray-finned fishes, which means that they have some bones that actually support the fins. In the case of true eels, these are basically soft fin rays. So they're not spiky, like, if you've ever been fishing and you've picked up a fish and it kind of spikes you with its dorsal fin or its pectoral fins. These don't have those kinds of bones. They're mostly marine fish, but not all of them. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But really the things that define Anguilliformes as true eels are this really elongated body. They're not very laterally compressed, so they're sort of cylindrical and tube-like. And then they have these specific patterns of reduction and fusion of their fins. So all true eels lack the pelvic fin, so that's the fin on the belly just behind the pectoral fins. Some also are missing the pectoral fins, but not all of them. And then all Anguilliformes have a fusion of the dorsal fin, the fin on the back, the caudal fin or tail fin, and then the anal fin, which is the most posterior fin on the bottom of the fish on the belly side. All of those are fused together into sort of a continuous fin that wraps around the posterior, mostly third of the body or so. And they use that in the particular form of locomotion that they do. So this is called anguilliform motion, which is really creative, eel-shaped motion. But they basically swim by writhing like a snake. So the entire body is involved in that form of locomotion instead of other fish, which kind of just use the tail fin and sort of the last third of the body back and forth. They're going in these very sinuous S-curves to move around.
Yeah.
There is a lot here that is comparable with snakes, which one of the reasons why eels are such cool fish, that they're shaped like snakes, that not only the elongation of the body, but they're moving in very much the same way. And I had never quite realized this, that eels also have limb reduction.
Yep.
That their fins, they're losing or shrinking the fins, which is also something that we see in a lot of on land long-bodied animals.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting how many parallels there are.
And similarly, going along with that, there's always a little bit of a question when you're talking to sort of the public about snakes, and it's like, do they have a really long tail? Are they mostly tail? Are they mostly neck? In the case of eels, it's mostly trunk. So they're fish, so they don't really have a neck. But they actually, if we look at the segmentation of their vertebrae, they have a very teeny tiny little tail. So the actual caudal peduncle that's longer in other fish that use more of that for swimming, they've kind of just got like a little stub tail, and it's mostly just trunk.
Yeah.
Interesting. Also the same as snakes.
Yeah.
Snakes are a long torso with usually a relatively short tail.
Well, it makes me think of like there are other long fish like barracuda that also have a fairly short tail, like it's mostly torpedo body and then a fairly short tail. So yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, and they get at this as, I'm sure you guys have touched on this on other episodes of the podcast, but if you're trying to elongate the spinal column, whether it's the whole body or whether it's a region, you basically got two ways of going about that, which is you take the same number of vertebrae and make them longer, like a giraffe neck, which has the same number of neck vertebrae as we do, or you just add more vertebrae to the column. And that's how eels have gotten at it. They've got a lot more vertebra. In fact, the vertebrate that has the largest number of vertebra is an eel, which I think the figure is about 750 vertebra in the column of this fish.
Awesome.
So they've got a ton of vertebra, and they're actually very short. So the centrum, sort of the cylindrical body of the vertebra, is kind of stubby. And so this means that they're really, really flexible. And so that's kind of the key to the eel body plan. They're not especially fast swimmers, but they are able to turn on a dime. They're able to get down into little rocks and crevices and just really have a high degree of flexibility.
I mean, because some of them literally can tie themselves into knots and stuff. And like, that's insane.
Yeah. Are they flexible? So obviously they need to be flexible side to side for that swimming motion. Are they also flexible in all directions?
Not to the same degree. Fish don't really do as much of the sort of plane of motion that's from the back to the belly. They don't have as much of that range of motion just because of how their vertebrae are shaped. Eels do have more than most fish, like certainly more than something like a goldfish does.
Yeah.
But most of that flexion is going to be in the side-to-side plane.
Gotcha.
Cool. Makes sense.
Cool.
With their 1,000 vertebrae. My goodness. I wasn't ready for that. Because snakes can have, 2, maybe 300 vertebrae. Because they've also done the same thing. They've added vertebrae to lengthen the body. I was not prepared for a number more than double that.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and say, not necessarily for the podcast, but for the blog post that goes along with this, you got to have a picture of this eel in there because they look so silly. They've got like a little... Their jaws go like this, like a little bird face. It's a snipe eel, and they're like incredibly long, incredibly thin, ridiculous looking animal.
Yep, it's one of those where it's how is there enough room in there for you to have the stuff you need?
Organs.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, are you respiring through your skin?
Great. So we've got the sort of the overview of Anguilliformes, but I hazard to guess that there is quite a lot of diversity under the umbrella of true eels. So how widespread are they? How many of them are there? What's the diversity of these eels?
Well, they are distributed pretty much globally. Like a lot of other fishes, you've got higher diversity in tropical regions, but they're also well up into sort of higher latitudes. And there are, as we'll discuss further, some species that actually enter into freshwater, at least for part of their life cycle. But overall, we're looking at around 1,000 species total in around 160 genera within about 20 families.
Nice.
So we've got in this order quite a range of sizes. So on the bigger end of things, you've got the conger eels and the moray eels, both of which are kind of fighting for the biggest eels that are out there.
Yeah.
But looking at animals that can top out around 55 pounds and get up to 4 meters in length.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big fish.
It's a big fish. On the absolute other end of that, some of the weird little deep water members of the order include the smallest members. So in the genus Monomethus, the biggest species in that genus can get up to about 6.5 inches.
That's a small fish.
Aw.
But still lengthy, still that long eel shape.
Mm-hmm. They're odd. They've got a lot of weird stuff going on. They look more like a tadpole than an eel.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Weird.
But yeah, when we look at sort of the overall anatomy and what types of specializations that we see, generally they're pretty evolutionarily conservative fish. They have a pretty basic body plan that they don't have a ton of variation on. They've usually got a head with a small snout. They're usually ambush predators. So not a ton of departure from sort of that basic body plan, but there are definitely exceptions to that. A lot of the deep sea eels are very strange. But even in tropical regions, you can get weird eels. So you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with garden eels, the cute little ones that they have at every aquarium.
Yep.
These are the ones that the Pokemon Wiglet is based off of.
Yes.
Right? The ones that pop up, that stick up out of the burrows.
Yeah, so they've got, in contrast with other eels, first of all, they're pretty small and slender. They've got big old eyes, and they've got these little snub faces because they're basically just poking out of a burrow and eating things that are passing by on the sand near their burrows.
Yeah. Are eels generally all predatory?
As far as I'm aware, I am sure that there are some, particularly the deep water ones, that are doing a significant portion of scavenging, just because of availability of food in that environment. But looking at the dentition, there's none that are even remotely specialized for anything like filter feeding or any kind of herbivory.
Also very snaky in that
I was going to
regard.
say, we're just racking up. We should have done this last month during Snake Month. So most eels, I infer, are open water predators for the most part. And then we've got those weird ones like the garden eels and the deep sea ones.
Yes, so a lot of them are sort of midwater predators. There's actually a ton of diversity that's associated with reef structures. So, for example, all the moray eels and a lot of the sort of conger eel associated species are going to be found in reefs, or at least in areas with structure. So they're going to be on the bottom where there's craggy rocks and any kind of sunken object or something that they can get down in and hunt around. But there is a pretty good diversity, both of deep sea species and of sort of these open water species.
Yeah.
Cool. That tracks with my earliest mental image of eel, like my childhood introduction to the concept of an eel, which was Super Mario 64, but where the eel is inside the little crevice, just poking his head out, which is the way that I picture moray eels much of the time.
That's a happy eel.
Yeah, exactly. And when it's so interesting because, as often comes up with what would typically be considered like a departure from the typical fish shape, and like a specialized shape for a group, often it would be easy to think, well, okay, so that you have to be doing like one thing because that's such a weird way to be. But the fact that there's like open water and deep sea and sea bottom eels is the shape is more versatile than you might think up front.
Again, very similar to what we've said about snakes, that they hit on an unusual body plan and then stuck with it, even though they diversified quite a bit, but then used that simple body plan to do a whole bunch of different things.
That it fits into more holes on the shaped board than you would expect.
Hmm. Well, like I was saying, like a lot of these animals are associated with like structure on the seafloor.
Mhm.
And so when you're down in like a reef, there's all kinds of holes. And not only are those good places for you to hide, it's good for, you sticking your head down in there and finding a little food item. But also thinking about things like gulper eels, which have co opted that long body to literally include an expansion of their pharynx so they can eat a large, large prey item that's maybe even bigger than them, or even things that aren't eels but definitely have a similar body shape, like frilled sharks. This sort of mysterious deep water fish that we really don't know that much about. And I do wonder if it's not the fact that being out in sort of a very open water environment or these very deep sea environments, having the maneuverability to turn around and just be able to grab something as soon as it passes by, as soon as you see it, might be really advantageous, and another way that they've kind of co-opted that shape for a different environment.
That is a really good point, because you can't do pursuit stuff down there because you can't see it far enough away to chase it down.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be able to react when you are within striking distance.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
What other weird weird corners of eel diversity or features are there? Or do you have favorites?
Favorites, it's got to be the deep sea eels, because it's kind of hard to beat a gulper eel or a pelican eel. I mean, their head is immense. They can swing their jaws pretty much 180 degrees open. There are a variety of other different lineages of deep sea eels, very skinny ones. There's also a group called bobtail eels that it looks like you start off with the head of a normal eel and then it just ends in sort of a blunt tail. So they're bob-tailed instead of having a tapering body.
Weird.
And then, of course, there's the weird pharyngeal jaws that moray eels have.
Yeah.
So if you've seen the movie Alien and are familiar with that disconcerting set of secondary jaws that protrude from the throat of the xenomorph, it's thought, I don't know if it's been officially confirmed, that was based off of the pharyngeal jaws that moray eels have. So pharyngeal jaws, something that most bony fish have. They're basically a secondary set of really not jaws, but just sort of toothy plates in the back of the throat, just in front of the esophagus. And so fish don't have hands. They can't hold stuff and take bites of it. So it helps to have something that can either sort of chop up your food or grind it up a little bit. In the case of moray eels, those jaws are hypermobile and actually look a lot more like a secondary set of jaws. And so basically that allows the eel to take a bite of something, get it into its mouth, and then because they've got a long way to go to actually get down into the gut, that secondary set of jaws reaches up, grabs, and pulls down, and then they can just swallow it normally.
Yeah. Because typically when we think of an animal eating something with just its mouth, it's a land animal, and they're able to do that kind of like throw it back and bite it again. Like when you watch a dog eat something, they'll bite it multiple times, but they'll move their head forward each time to get it further into the mouth. But you can't do that in the water because it'll just, the things don't move the same way. So they just literally have a helping hand in the mouth. You could see it happen when they fed the morays at the aquarium, where they bite the fish and then they would just let go of it and the fish would just move further into the mouth. You couldn't see the pharyngeal jaw from the outside, but you would just see the fish just go further in, as if the fish was trying to feed the eel.
I like the idea of it as just a hand puppet. It just reaches back, pulls it further back into the puppet.
Thank you.
It's been hypothesized that because a lot of fish use suction feeding, so basically as they open the mouth, they increase the volume, decreases the pressure, it pulls food inwards. But morays, like I've discussed, are really associated with these sort of like tight crevices. Like they like to be down in a hole. And it might be a situation where you don't have quite as much room to open your mouth all the way. Really, they don't have the same suction feeding capability that other fishes do, just because they're mostly a tube. So maybe that's something they've had to adapt to in these sort of close quarter environments.
Yeah, cool.
Interesting. This is one of the few things that I did know about eels, is that moray eels have jaws inside their jaws. It's a second mouth inside their mouth.
Well, it's one of the best nature fun facts, because it's one of those where you explain it to people and they go, oh, that's weird, and then you show it to them and they go, oh, that's weirder than I thought.
Yeah, it's one of those, and it's part of why I'm happy that we've sort of lingered on it a little bit, because it's the kind of thing that if you just explain it quickly, I think it's easy to misunderstand, because what it actually is more ridiculous than I think people are often willing to accept. It's like, no, it is actually as nonsense and cartoony as how we described it.
Mouth in a mouth.
It is a mouth inside your mouth.
Yes.
So, sort of taking a step out as we're talking about these eels, these, nothing comes from nowhere. where on the fish family tree, I don't know anything about fish phylogeny, but who are the Anguilliformes close related to?
So Anguilliformes fits within the superorder Ellopomorpha. And so these are very, very basal fish. I won't use the term primitive because I don't want to give the wrong idea.
Yes.
They've been evolving as long as everything else has. But if we were to stack up the fish family tree, some of the most basal members would be things like lungfish and then sturgeon and gars. Ellopomorpha are pretty much the first fish outside of that group of very early fishes.
Okay.
And they're actually in there with some odd housemates. So other things in Ellopomorpha include another group that get lumped in with eels a lot, which are these spiny deep sea eels, but also ladyfish, tarpon, and bonefish, and other fish that are really popular large sport fish.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that unites these guys, because if you actually look at the adult fishes, they do not resemble one another very much. But one of the things that unites all of these fish, and is also a very distinctive trait of eels, is that they all have a similar larval stage called a leptocephalus. So lots of fish, especially marine fish, go through a larval stage where they're basically just plankton, oftentimes look way different from the adults. So leptocephali are a distinctive larval stage unique to Ellopomorphs that are thin, transparent, and almost ribbon-like larvae with a little tiny head. That's leptocephalus means like small head, slate head. So even things like tarpon, which, are these big fighting fish that you see, lacquered and preserved on the wall of a Margaritaville or something like that.
Yeah.
They start off as these funny little transparent larvae.
Oh, that's weird. Because I've seen pictures of eel larvae before, and they are very extreme and very weird. But I can see how that becomes an eel. Like, I wasn't super surprised. That is very weird. That something the shape of a tarpon also starts out that shape. Mm-hmm. That is, I would not have ever pegged that. Weird.
They're very strange. And they do all kinds of other crazy things. Like some of them have stalked eyes to increase their field of view. Some of them have like weird diverticula of intestines that kind of don't protrude out of the body wall, but the body wall protrudes around them.
Oh, weird.
So yeah, they're very strange. This is what you get with very basal fishes. They do weird things in development.
Huh. Yeah, these were fish. This fish still working out how to be fished.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
One can imagine a world where this is the group that became the widespread, most successful group of fish, and then all fish would start out as weird little leptocephali and then turn into eels.
Yep.
So speaking of leptocephali, this particular larval form that eels have, one of the other few things that I know to be famous about eels is their life cycles. Mm-hmm. I know that they do wacky things over the course of their development. So please go off about eel life cycles.
Yeah, so again, most eels are marine and they live in the oceans their entire lives. So they'll all start out as leptocephali. Leptocephali tend to live in open water, but relatively shallow in that water. And they basically drift around eating marine snow. So just random organic detritus until they grow up into a closer to adult form. The ones that have really complex sort of chains of development are the catadromous eels. So catadromous is where you have an animal that starts its life in saltwater and then goes into freshwater to live most of its life and then goes back to saltwater to breed. So if you're familiar with how Northwest salmon do, it's the opposite of that. So instead of being born in freshwater and then going out and coming back, they're born in the oceans and then eventually come back. So they start off as leptocephali. Then they'll get to a stage where they're beginning to lose sort of the ribbon-like flattened shape, and they're getting more of an eel shape, but they're still transparent. So at that stage, they're called glass eels, and that's when they usually start working their way up. And you might have heard about these because they get attention sometimes because they are some of the most expensive seafood, basically, that you can get. People will go out on during these eel runs where they're trying to make their way up into the freshwater and just gather handfuls of little glass eels. So they get up into freshwater, and as they're sort of making their way up into the headwaters where they're going to spend their time, they continue developing. They reach a stage where they're basically like a miniature adult, and those are called elvers, and then continue growing while in freshwater. Eventually, they reach their adult stage, which is oftentimes called silver eels. And then at that stage, once they've reached maturity after a couple of years, they make their way back down into the ocean, spawn, and die. So this is actually only something that one genus does. So the same freshwater eels that we have here in North America and in Europe and I think Asia, all of these are in the genus Anguilla.
Okay.
As far as I know, there's only one other species of eel that does this, and they're actually freshwater their entire lives. So it's really just one group that's doing this very dramatic journey from the ocean to the rivers and back again.
And I heard about them a while back because they were famous for like being a mystery as to where the eels were coming from for a long time, which it was always one of those things that baffled me, how an animal we lived so close next to could remain so mysterious.
Yeah, I want to say that particular study found that a lot of these catadromous eels from, like, again, North America were breeding in, or at least the larvae were living in, like, the Sargasso Sea.
Yeah.
And these areas with a lot of structure, I guess, where being a little tiny transparent fish, you've got a lot of real estate to hide out from things that would love to eat you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this came up in the migration episode.
Yes.
At 187, where we talked about, there was some study that I came across that is tracing where these eels and other migratory animals are ending up or heading to. In order to, because, it's easy for us to track something in a river. It becomes a lot harder for us to track it once it gets out into the ocean. So there have been a number of different approaches to trying to figure out, usually like DNA or isotopic studies. Like, are the eels here in the middle of the ocean the same as the eels that we see over in this river system? Which
is especially important if you're trying to protect that species.
Yes.
You need to protect this river and the Sargasso Sea.
Yes, you can't hunt here.
And that's become a big deal because a lot of these freshwater eels have been heinously overharvested.
Yeah.
Not only have they been suffering because, again, their larvae, basically, as they're trying to enter into freshwater, are being collected, but also the construction of dams, the construction of bridges, the construction of weirs, anything that's going to provide a barrier. They're really good at getting over obstacles because, again, they're just wriggling like a snake. So they're pretty good at climbing. But if you put, a 25-foot tall dam in there, they're not going to have any chance of making it over. And then you've completely broken the life cycle and that population is not going to be able to persist.
Yeah.
So being able to track these things and the routes that they're taking is rather important for conserving at least this genus of eel.
This is also another one of those weird things that happens with fish, and it also happens with amphibians, where they change so much over the course of their life that they get a different name at different points in their development. Like frogs, we have tadpoles, and there are salamanders that have like efts. That this is one species of eel that goes through being like 4 different types of eel. Over the course of it, like a Pokemon, it goes through these different distinct stages.
And at a pretty distinctive sort of trophic place, so a different place in the food chain with each of these, because they are, pretty large eels when they're adults. And so they're eating other fish, they're eating invertebrates, they're eating whatever they want to. Whereas at the smallest scale, they are literally eating particles of just detritus. Whatever they can get their hands on. Or fins on, I guess.
Or lack of fins.
Or lack of fins.
As it were. Their mouths. They can get their mouths on. So you mentioned earlier in the discussion that the word eel is used to refer to a bunch of different groups of fish. We've mainly been talking about true eels, the Anguilliformes, and I can think of at least one example that some of our listeners may be wondering why it hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's because it's not an eel. So if we could just briefly go over, what are some of the not eel eels that are out there?
So I've focused basically on 3 groups. There are a lot of fish that get called eels. Things like lampreys and hagfish also get called eels, but they're in completely different groups of fish. So I'm going to focus on the ones that look a little bit more like Anguilliformes. So the first one, the one I believe you were alluding to, is the electric eel. So with the magnificent scientific name Electrophorus electricus, names where you know exactly what's going on.
That's an old school golden age superhero name.
So they are long. They do have modified fins, but they are not eels. They're actually knife fish. So in the family Gymnotidae or Order Gymnotiformes. And these guys have eel-like bodies for about the same reason that Anguilliformes do. So these are fish that are native to rivers in South America and Africa. These rivers tend to be really turbid. There's a bunch of stuff down at the bottom, and so they're living in a very complex environment with lots of stuff to swim under and around. So similar to our other eels, they've got this long body that allows them a lot of maneuverability. But what's fun is that, of course, the electric eel is famous for having this ability to induce electric shocks. But pretty much all members of that family have some electrosensitivity or some ability to generate an electric shock because they're living in these really, really muddy rivers. Mm-hmm. So there's no point in them having good eyesight because they can't see in the first place.
Yeah.
But being able to sense or to feel prey items around them is much more advantageous than actually being able to see them.
Makes sense.
And even though they do have, again, sort of this similar body shape, and they do have a really long anal fin and they're missing that pelvic fin, they actually swim in a completely different way. They don't undulate. They mostly swim around by moving that anal fin. So they've just got one fin that sort of starts around the caudal fin and loops under their body. And they mostly, it's harder to see in electric eels because they do just kind of fumble around if you've seen them in aquaria. But most other knife fish just kind of wiggle that like little fin on the underside of their body, and that's where they get most of their propulsion.
Yeah, because when I think of a knife fish, the first thing I think of is their ability to like move forward and then just immediately reverse by changing the undulation of that fin, and their body does not change shape as they do that. And it's very like you put the video in reverse.
Oh yeah.
And it's definitely very un-eel-like.
Yeah, and that's why they can also swim upside down pretty efficiently because it's just the one fin, and being able to undulate it in any way will still propel them.
That's cool.
Nice.
So the other group that tends to get lumped in with eels is less well known, but they're actually kind of common in the aquarium trade. These are eels in the order Cynbrachiformes, and they're oftentimes called swamp eels. You also hear them called spiny eels. When you see them in like aquarium stores, they're usually fire eels or dragon eels or something else dramatic like that.
Yep.
Unlike the Anguilliformes, these are predominantly freshwater species. There's only a handful of those that are marine, and they're distributed mostly just in the southern hemisphere rather than globally. And they look pretty similar, but one, where the actual name of the group comes in, they have a very different gill morphology. So they've got sort of small gill openings that meet closer to the midline at the bottom of the throat, rather than sort of gill flaps like a lot of fish have. And as I noted earlier, Anguilliformes have soft fin rays. So they've got sort of these billowing fins. These guys have spiny fin rays. So if you were to try to pick them up, if you were to grab one of those pectoral fins or dorsal fins, they've actually got bones in there that you would be able to feel.
Yeah. That made me think of a question I had about eel gills, because that was something that always stood out to me when I observed the moray eel, is that they just had like, they didn't have a gill flap the same way that we think of other fish. They just had like a hole at the back of their head. Is that particularly variable among true eagles?
I do not know.
Yeah.
I am inclined to say that is something that morainids do, just the morays do.
Yeah.
That is kind of different because the freshwater eels don't look like that.
Yeah, that's what I couldn't remember them well enough to picture a freshwater eel and see if they had it.
They do still have, if you actually look at the skeleton, they do still have the opercular series. So the bones are in there.
Oh, cool.
And what's that third group of not eels that you were going to tell us about?
Yeah, so these are eels, in quotes, in the order Nodacanthiformes. And so these are called deep sea spiny eels. As the name suggests, they live in typically deep marine environments, and they're really funny looking fish. They've got really big, robust heads, and then unlike an eel body, which kind of gently tapers as you get towards the tail, their body immediately begins tapering right after the head, and so they've just got a little silly sort of tadpole-shaped body.
Interesting.
So they aren't typically as elongate as a lot of Anguilliformes are, but what's fun is that this order is sister to Anguilliformes. So it's two groups of elongate fish. They're both more closely related to one another than they are to any other group of fish. So they probably were descended from an ancestor that already had that sort of semi-elongate body form.
Yeah. And then they shrunk it down.
Basically, yeah.
They're the weird outgroup.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the other weird thing about them is that because they are closely related to Anguilliformes, they're in that superorder Elopomorpha, so they do start out as a leptocephalus. Most of the time, all these other Elopomorphs start off as a leptocephalus and they just grow. The leptocephalus is smaller than the adult form.
Yes.
In the Nodacanthiformes, they can actually reduce their body size by up to half as they grow in quotes again, into their adult size. So they shrink as they mature.
Yeah.
Weird.
Deep sea is so bizarre.
That's
wow.
very strange. Like, growing into a smaller adult form feels like a thing. I believe invertebrates doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Vertebrates doing that feels very strange.
Yeah.
Well, it's very much a larval animal. Like when we think
Yes.
of larvae, it's typically like, okay, invertebrates are what you think of first, and then some sort of like lower vertebrates. This is real larval transitions to adulthood, like a completely different morphotype, a completely different ecology to these animals. It's very strange.
This is similar to what we see in some insects. We talked about this in the dragonflies episode 181, that these are animals that spend most of their lives as a larval form, which is doing something completely different from what they're going to end up doing when they turn into adults, which is usually a relatively short time period.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Weird fish. Fish are weird.
That's so bizarre.
Speaking of weird things, I also appreciate the fact that we've got deep sea eels, which are Anguilliformes, and we've got spiny eels, which are a different group, and we've got deep sea spiny eels, which is yet another different group.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep.
It's the trifecta.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. So for all of our listeners, if you're trying to keep track, there will be a quiz.
I have a random question about things that may or may not be eels, because one of my favorites are wolf eels, which have the big mouths and they like crunch up urchins and stuff. I don't know. I've always wondered whether those were true eels, because they have such big heads for compared to most other eels.
So no, they are actually not eels. They are more closely related to scorpion fish. So like sort of all those big head, bottom dwelling fish, they're in the order Scorpeniformes, but they are in their own family. But yeah, and if you look at their teeth, you can kind of see that because they've got rather blunt teeth.
Yes, yeah.
That's something that a lot of other like toadfish and things like that are bottom dwellers oftentimes have that sort of dentition.
Yeah. So. Yeah, because I always saw them and they didn't feel eel-y, but I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong or what didn't fit. But I was always curious about them. All right, cool.
Fantastic. Well, with that, whirlwind tour of eels, things that are eels, things that are not eels, and things that wish they were eels. Once again, thanks to our pal Ryan. Let's take a short break for a musical interlude. And then when we come back, we can start talking about the fossil record and the evolutionary history of eels, which I'm also very excited about because I know less about fossil eels than I know about living eels. And so nothing.
Yep.
Nothing at all.
I have no info.
Stay tuned. All right, Shay, please tell us about the eel fossil record. Are there eel fossils? What do eel fossils look like?
So there are eel fossils. The first ones that I could find evidence of, so keep in mind this is my literature review, so this might not be 100%, but the oldest ones that I could find records of come from the Cinnamanian, so the early part of the Cretaceous around 99 million years ago, and they're from Lebanon. And there's a number of papers that describe these really gorgeous fossils. They're sort of smushed flat, but it's basically the entire skull of these eels preserved in mostly 2 dimensions. My comprehension of the stuff going on in those papers was limited by the fact that they were in French, which I do not speak.
That was your first mistake.
Yeah, but they do have some really great figures. They're described as basically none of them are in living genera, but they are referred to the order Anguilliformes, and they look pretty similar. They already show some of the characteristics that we associate with modern eels, which includes the fusion of certain bones in the cranium, the loss of certain bones. So they look relatively modern when they first show up, but they're not quite as long. So they're still elongate fish, but they don't appear to have sort of those shortened vertebrae and quite as many of them.
Yeah.
So they're getting toward being eel-shaped, but they're not as eel-shaped as modern eels.
Yeah, they have more the face of an eel than the body of an eel at this
Very
point.
much so, yeah.
Interesting.
That is interesting. So true eels were somewhat eel-like, swimming around with ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and such back in the early part of the Cretaceous. That's cool.
Yeah.
It's always fun to know, especially because there are so many things in the world today that are weird and recent.
Mm-hmm.
It's always fun to know that this is a weird type of fish that also you could have run into in the latter half of the Mesozoic era.
Well, it's actually more recent than I was expecting, because eels are so ubiquitous today. Like they're just all over the world. So I was assuming that not that they would go back as far as sharks, but they were going to be in kind of a similar situation as sharks. So Cretaceous is actually more recent than I was expecting.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was kind of hooked on, if I remember correctly, seahorses.
Yep. Which were
episode 136, which are a recent.
Yes.
They're a weird thing, but they're also pretty recent thing geologically.
Yeah, which is a very good comparison.
And that's one of the things that I was actually just about to talk about, is these 99 million year old fossils seem to represent sort of an early radiation of this body type, of this group. But when we look at the fossil record, what we actually see eels sort of take off is after the end Cretaceous extinction event, after the KPG, which a lot of modern, especially ray fin fishes, really got their start at this time, because a bunch of those Mesozoic fishes got killed off. There was huge turnover in both invertebrate and vertebrate taxa in the seas. Think of all of those giant marine reptiles that were suddenly not apex predators anymore. And possibly as there's all of these niches available, we see after the KPG, around 50 million years ago, we see suddenly a lot more eels showing up in the fossil record. So a lot of Paleocene, Eocene, and Miocene sites have otoliths, but not great fossils. So
cool. What's an otolith?
Yes. So an otolith, it literally means ear stone. And it's this secreted structure inside sort of the ear region of fish. And while it is non-analogous in terms of how it actually functions to our inner ear, it does most of the same things for them. So it helps them with hearing. It helps them detect basically which way is up. It helps them detect pressure. So they are really, really excellent fossils to find because, one, they're super durable. So if you've got skeletons that are being laid down in an environment where that skeleton is just not going to stay together, like there's a lot of abrasion and the bones are going to get chipped away and broken, or even if you've got them being deposited in, for whatever reason, a really acidic environment and that skeleton's going to sort of dissolve away, the otoliths are different chemically and they'll stick around. So you might have 1,000 otoliths and no bones, but they're still great because they're very diagnostic. So based on the features of the otolith, you can generally tell at the very least what family and oftentimes what genus of fish you're looking at.
Wow.
So they're very useful. However, they don't tell us anything about the morphology of the rest of the animal. They don't tell us how long these fish were. They don't tell us what they were eating. So we just basically knew that eels were continuing to diversify throughout the early part of the Cenozoic, but we don't have a very complete picture except for a handful of sites that have phenomenal preservation of full skeletons, sometimes even with soft tissue.
Nice. Cool. That it's always so weird when you have enough to have like the spark notes of what was going on with the group.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, so what were those eels like? There were a lot of them.
Yes.
That's
abundant.
Yep. They had ears.
Diversifying. You just get the play-by-play.
Yes.
Yeah, so a couple of Eocene sites in Europe specifically have really good eel fossils. One of them is near Verona, and the site gets nicknamed the Fishbowl or Peschiara. And again, some of these have really excellent preservation. There's even a species that's described from there called Paranguilla tigrina, and it has spots all over its body, little spots. So sort of like the golden tail morays or the banana morays that you see today. They looked very similar. Hard to tell what sort of the base color under that was, but the fossils are just stunning.
Cool.
Yeah. And there is, I don't know if you guys have touched on Messel Pit before.
We have. Episode 160 was the Messel Pit.
There is one eel fossil from the Messel Pit. Out of their 10,000 plus fish specimens, there is one eel. It's a pretty good fossil. It's its own species, but it's referred to the modern genus Anguilla. So it's those modern catadromous ones. So it's been hypothesized that maybe they only have that one because it was basically an isolated lake and it wouldn't have been able to get out of there to breed, and others wouldn't have been able to make their way back in to the lake.
Yeah, that was my first thought, is that Messel is a lake. That's a freshwater environment. It's very cool that this freshwater environment has a member of the genus that has those eels today that move up into freshwater.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Also very cool to have just a representative of a living genus all the way back in the Eocene. This happens a lot for invertebrates and stuff, but for something that's just a fish that's swimming around today, it's cool to be like, oh yeah, there's your cousin from 50 million years ago.
Neat.
So it sounds like there's a handful of really nice fossil deposits with really well-preserved eel fossils, but other than that, it sounds like there's not a whole lot of eel fossils.
Not good ones, at the very least. They show up, especially as we get later into the Cenozoic, they show up as fragmentary remains all over the place.
Yeah.
So you'll have, again, they have distinctive sort of fused bones, the premaxilla and the vomer sort of bones of the upper palate fuse. So those will show up in various deposits. You'll find them in archaeological sites and things like that. But it seems like there's just not been as much opportunity. They don't tend to live in sort of the lagoon or bay-like environments that preserved a lot of these other Lagerstätte or places with really excellent preservation. So at least as far as the early part of the Cenozoic, when they really were approaching sort of modern levels of diversity, we just don't have that great a picture of them.
Gotcha. This is a trend that we've seen in a number of other groups as well. Snakes have this to a degree. Bats are a great example of this, where there's like a handful of sites that are really good, and then just tens of millions of years of barely identifiable fragments.
Yeah.
Actually, Messel Pit is one of those bat sites.
Yeah.
Incidentally, is where you get a lot of good bats. So yeah, and not terribly surprising, I guess. Eels sort of have that snake thing where there's just a length of small individual bones that easily come apart.
Oh yeah, and they have, snakes also have the same thing where they have this highly kinetic skull, so it's not like they really have any bones that like to stay together in the cranium, so the vertebral column is gone. It's going to fall apart. Fish never have. Aside from the bones that actually house the brain, everything else is very loosely connected with connective tissue.
Yes.
So without extraordinary preservation in rather unusual circumstances, if you're just an eel floating in the bottom of like an embayment, you are going to be scavenged and your bones are going to be spread to the four winds. So
yeah. Lucky they have very characteristic bones and adaptations.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because with snakes, most snakes in the fossil record are identified based on vertebrae, because that is available and diagnostic enough. Mm-hmm. Are most eel fossils identified from those otoliths? Are there other bones that are like commonly found and identified for eels?
Otoliths, I'm not as sure. I just know that was for sort of the middle chunk of the Cenozoic. A lot of the sites where they found these things, it was predominantly otoliths.
Gotcha.
Most of the fossil taxa that I'm aware of are described based on basically isolated jaws.
Yeah.
Cool.
Because with fish, vertebrae are usually only diagnostic to the family level.
Yeah.
So you could say, okay, this is an eel, or you could say this is a wrasse or whatever. But you're not going to be able to get any finer than that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Cool.
So for completeness' sake, since we mentioned in the first half of the episode that there are a bunch of other groups that are called eels that aren't technically eels, but we did talk about them a bit, are there fossils of the other groups of, quote, eels?
So Synbranchiformes do not have a fossil record. They are native to tropical regions and are native to freshwater.
Gotcha. Are these the swamp eels?
These are the swamp eels, yes. So they are not in a position to fossilize well, just based on where they have been located geographically. So no fossil record for them. Nodacanthiformes, rather, those deep sea spiny eels, they also show up in the late Cretaceous of Lebanon. So relatively close in proximity to where they were finding those anguilliform fossils. But later in the Cretaceous, we see the nodacanths show up. So that does indicate to us that there's got to be some kind of a gap if these guys came from a common ancestor and we're finding anguilliforms in the early Cretaceous and then the sister taxon a little bit later. Maybe those earliest anguilliforms are actually sort of an ancestral population Maybe there's just a gap in the fossil record. And I did not find anything on Gymnotiformes probably have a fossil record, but I could not find anything that was a good write-up on it. So
Gotcha. So it sounds like all of our other eels are mostly missing from the fossil record.
Yeah.
And deep sea fishes don't have the best fossil record generally, but also Gymnotiformes are native to tropical regions. Symbranchiformes, the spiny eels, also native to tropical regions. These are areas that, based on climate, based on the types of sediment that are being deposited there, and also based on the feasibility of doing field work to actually collect these fossils, they tend to be really underrepresented.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like even in the true eels, the Anguilliformes, which are extremely abundant and extremely diverse, even they don't seem like they have a particularly great fossil record. So these smaller, more geographically limited groups that are less diverse and a bit more limited in their range, it's not terribly surprising that they would be largely missing from the fossil record. If the really big group isn't making it that often into the fossil record, I'm not surprised electric eels have managed to skip it.
Especially given that, most Anguilliformes are marine fish, and you're always going to have a better record of anything that's living in the ocean than you are anything that's living in freshwater. Everything that lives in the ocean tends to have some kind of representation in the fossil record, sometimes over-representation. Things from terrestrial environments do not get nearly the same chance at being preserved.
Yeah. Yep. Makes a lot of sense.
You mentioned that one anguilla from the Messel pit that is a maybe kind of could be an indicator of that freshwater to saltwater lifestyle. Just thinking about the unusual features we talked about before, are there any fossil indicators of those pharyngeal jaws we were talking about?
I do know that fairly recently in the fossil record, they do start turning up because they're very sharp. And one of the things with pharyngeal jaws is that the teeth tend to fuse onto the bone a little more tightly than they do in basically the oral jaws at the front of the mouth, or when you have fish that have sort of a tooth plate where you've got a lot of really tiny teeth. If you've got some big teeth, they tend to be kind of welded on there. So I don't know of any specific examples, but I do know that in like Pliocene and Pleistocene coastal deposits, you'll sometimes see those pharyngeal jaws turning up.
That's super cool. What a cool thing to find.
Yeah. Oh, man. Eels are cool.
So let's move back up towards you were talking about those early Cretaceous fossils and the early evolution. What do we know, or what do we suspect about the origins and early evolution of true eels?
So based on the paleo environment where we're finding these earliest eel fossils, and also I think based on sort of looking at the habits of eels as they grow. So they start off in open water and tend to inhabit open water until either they basically go to ground if they're marine species and take to cover, or begin traveling back up into freshwater. So where these early eel fossils are coming from appears to be an open water environment. So we're assuming based on this that these early sort of, early Cretaceous eels were mostly living in open water habitats. And that after the end Cretaceous extinction, after the KPG event, when these new niches opened up is when you start to have adaptations to shallower water. And then later throughout the Paleogene and into the Neogene, that's when we really see the diversification. So like early Miocene is when most of the living genera either show up in the fossil record or have been estimated using genetic differences basically to have split from one another. So that's about the time where you really have diversification of reef habitats. So you've got scleractinian corals becoming major reef builders. You've got these ecosystems, again, continuing to recover from the extinction of all of these animals in the end Cretaceous. So in them sort of elongating during this period, becoming the eels that we know today, may be associated with the spread of complex habitats that makes high maneuverability, high flexibility more advantageous for them.
Interesting. So it sounds like they might have started out as, forgive me for generalizing, relatively normal fish, sort of out in the open water, Long-bodied, but like Will, you mentioned before, there are other long-bodied fish that are not eel-like.
Yes.
Long bodies is not completely out of the
You
ordinary.
get oarfish and stuff like that.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned the barracudas,
Mhm.
which are sort of long-bodied.
Mhm.
And then after, and this is a trend we see in a lot of groups, that they were around in the Mesozoic, and then it's after the end Cretaceous mass extinction, episode 5, all this new ecological space is opened up and they're able to start to diversify. The link with coral habitats is really interesting because we were talking before about how that body shape is really good for navigating those complex environments, for coral reefs and such like that. So the fact that we see them potentially diversifying along with those habitats makes a lot of sense.
I had that same thought talking about the pharyngeal jaws showing up relatively recently, of wondering if there was a similar, that they were now interacting in those habitats in a way that made that jaw more useful.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, yeah. I mean, just squeezing into tight spaces is not a morphotype that a lot of large animals get into. I mean,
Mhm.
reefs are so like three-dimensionally complex. Of course, that's one of the
Yes.
reasons that they provide such great habitat. But a lot of the denizens of the reef are little tiny fishes.
Yes.
So if you want to eat those or occupy the same spaces to keep from being eaten by things bigger than you, you're going to have to modify some stuff to be able to fit into these teeny tiny spaces.
And they really can. This came up before we started recording, but the eels that we would have at the aquarium would just wedge themselves in places. And one of the most common questions we get is it stuck? I was like, I guarantee he's not. I guarantee. And feeding time would start and he'd just wriggle right out. But tons of times it's like, you are pressed way up against the glass, but you're just snug in there.
Yeah. Do we know anything about the evolutionary history of those pharyngeal jaws? The specialized ones we see in the morays? Is it as simple as it's just regular pharyngeal jaws, but more?
It is the same bones that are making up the same like structure in
Yeah.
other fishes. I don't know how many, because there's a variety of sort of morphologies of the pharyngeal jaws. Most fish have two very simple paired bones on the bottom and then like three pairs on the top, and they just form two plates that meet together or kind of rub back and forth. But it is derived from the same structure, so it's like another gill arch that's been modified to create these jaws. So it's not that dissimilar in origin, but it is highly dissimilar in the actual function and the morphology of these. So
Cool.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about sort of the benefits of this specialization, what eels are sort of specialized to do. We've mentioned now a few times that there are a number of different groups that have settled on this long eel-like body shape, which is really fascinating. My outline here says, as I've written it, what's the deal with the convergent evolution of eel shapes?
well, it's a good shape to be.
Yeah.
If you are trying to move fast, it is not a good shape to be. That is not a very efficient form of locomotion for moving at high speeds, at least relative to the actual length of your body, because it does require sort of this elongate form. But if you are in a situation where you need to be able to maneuver and maneuver quickly, it's a really good shape to be in. So as we mentioned earlier, it's going to allow you to turn around really quickly. So whether that's to get away from something, to duck back into your burrow, to turn around and snag a piece of food as it goes by, you've got incredible amounts of flexibility and you can move that distance pretty quickly. So another reason that some of these fish have turned out with this body shape is the advantage of burrowing, and also specifically with fishes that need to move over land for small distances oftentimes have this elongate shape. So thinking of, well, for loaches, that's another example of a fish that we didn't really touch on because nobody calls them eels. But they tend to burrow, they tend to get into little crevices, so having a little worm-shaped body is good for that. But also lungfish and what are called, I believe, walking catfish. They're in the family Cleriidae. All of those have relatively long bodies. They've got modified fins. So in the case of lungfish, they're using this to burrow and then sometimes using that body shape to actually go across dry land to get back to a watering hole. And same thing with these catfish. So they're able to just sort of wiggle their way using this semi-snake-like motion across dry land in order to get to a better pond or to get away from a pond that's drying out.
Yeah.
It is very notable and fun to think about how this sort of long body shape, which is weird for fish, not necessarily super rare, but it's a weird thing for fish to do, exists. This kind of goes to what you were saying before, Will, exists to allow fish to do things that fish aren't supposed to be able to do.
Yeah.
Like moving across land, right? The snake shape is good for both aquatic and terrestrial motion, but also the idea of a fish, especially a large fish, adapting to navigating and hunting not near a reef habitat, but within the reef. Sort of the fish equivalent of animals that adapt to move through trees or to burrow into the ground. That's a very unusual and specialized lifestyle. It makes sense that these eels and other fish like that would have to develop different anatomy. And it's not surprising that they've converged on the same sort of approach.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And especially when it comes to burrowing, because when you're an animal that's trying to get into the substrate, but you have no limbs, and you could use your mouth to dig, but you also need your mouth to breathe. You've got to just basically be able to wriggle your way into the substrate. And that is easier if you have a sort of long, sinuous body than if you've got a little laterally compressed fish body.
Well, it's you're going worm mode. It's like one of the most famous and thought of subterranean creatures. It's like, yeah, if you are long and skinny, you are not having to move as much dirt to get through it.
Yeah, and you don't have limbs getting in the way, like your fins or your legs aren't getting caught on stuff along the way.
And in the case of eels, you've got no scales, so you're even exuding less friction against the substrate because you're just slimy.
Point.
Yeah. I was actually going to say, they're also, you mentioned that they're slimy, they're mucusy. Is that, do they do something in particular with that slimy mucus, or is it just about being a slippery fish?
Will might know this better than I do, but all fish pretty much produce a mucus coating on the outside of their scales. They just don't have scales underneath, so they're just slime on skin.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's a big part of their immune system and stuff like that. Like if they lose that mucus layer, it's like having an open wound kind of. They're exposed to the environment.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite eel facts, is the green moray eel is green because of the yellow mucus on its brown skin.
Oh, interesting.
If you pet a moray eel, you would rub off some of the mucus and you'd see brown eel underneath.
Gross.
Yeah.
Everything about that is gross.
Yeah.
The slime is gross. The colors are all gross.
Yep.
Those are all gross color choices.
Yep. It's this nice yellow mucus.
Gross yellow on gross brown that makes gross green.
That's a color of mucus most of us would go to the doctor for.
Yes. You gotta go see somebody about that. Well, fantastic. Is there anything else? Do you have any last fun facts or things that you have about eels? Do you have a favorite species of eels?
My favorite eel is actually not a true eel, I'm ashamed to say.
Go on.
I had for a time, I might still have him. He stays burrowed 90% of the time. I just haven't seen him in a while. I have a Synbranchiform eel. It's in the genus Masticimulus. So he's a little eel. They're more laterally compressed than most Anguilliformes. So he's a little bit more like a fish, but he sits on the bottom. And the cutest thing is that most fish in that order actually have a little snout. So they've got like a nose tube, basically. So they will sniff around when you feed them. So they'll just sniff around, and then they feed much more like a pipefish or something, where they've got this extended snout. So you'll just see them sniff around, hone in on a piece of food, and then go.
Yep.
And just pull it in from a distance.
That reverse hiccup thing.
That's adorable. Is this one of those the fire eels you were mentioning? It's one of the swamp eels, right?
Yeah, it is a smaller member of that, but it's the same genus as the fire eels, which are sort of the bigger and more brightly colored. But mine's name is Udon Noodle. And he's a very, very cute fish.
Nice.
Fantastic.
Speaking of cute eels, this is just another story. We had garden eels at the aquarium. And this was after I was there, but I had friends there, so they were keeping me up to date. During the pandemic, there weren't people going into the aquarium, but garden eels are very shy, so you have to keep them socialized, or else they will just hide all day while guests are there. So they had to put webcams up so that people could keep interacting and visiting the eels, so that they wouldn't be fully people shy when the aquarium opened back up.
They need to have Zoom calls to keep them company during the pandemic.
To keep them socialized.
Oh man, that's fantastic!
Yep.
What an incredible note to end with cute. Well, and I love when we get to point out. I mean, pointing out animals that are cute is always great because it helps make them relatable. I will admit, I do not think of fish generally as being cute animals. I would not have guessed that our discussion would end with cute eels. No offense to eels and the eel lovers; they don't strike me as cute animals. But those are very cute stories.
Yeah.
That's about as cute as eels get.
Yeah.
I mean, they're social. They hang out with other eels. They've got little tiny faces. They stick out of a hole all day. It's really hard to beat that.
Yeah. They got social anxiety. They're very relatable eels.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shay, thank you so much for coming on here and talking with us about eels. I have learned a lot. Almost everything in this episode was news to me, which is fantastic. Listeners, we hope that you have also enjoyed this eel discussion. We've talked about a bunch of eels that are cool visually, and in the blog post, we'll put together a bunch of pictures and we'll have links and names and stuff so that you can learn more. Before we wrap everything up, there is one last thing to do in the episode, and that is our patron question. Every episode, we like to end off by answering a question submitted by our patrons. This is one of the benefits that our patrons can get from subscribing to us on Patreon. For this episode, we have a question. This is not a question about eels, but it is about fish. So we're in the sort of the right range. And it's a fun one, Shay, to have you answer with us. Quantum Robin asks, do we know what Helicoprion's strange mouth was for? And are there any other convergent mouths in the fossil record? So before we answer that question, Helicoprion. Will, would you like to describe Helicoprion?
This is one of my favorite fossil shark cousins. Helicoprion was a decently sized, I can't remember the exact length, but it was not a small shark. And it has a whirl of teeth, like a buzz saw of teeth in the mouth that is a continuously replacing like shark teeth, but in a spiral, and would have been sitting straight up and down in the mouth.
And this is a Devonian?
Early
right?
to middle Permian.
Permian. Oh, okay, Permian.
Yeah.
So, 300 or so million years ago.
If I remember right, it's more in the group of like the chimeras and the ratfish side of things. Yeah.
Cool.
Precisely.
So, Shay, do you have any striking insights into the evolution of Helicoprion's bizarre mouth?
Well, I don't, but other people do, and I was able to read those.
Great.
So, short answer is we do have a much better idea these days than we have in the past. You might have seen some reconstructions, so various authors and artists have put that tooth whorl in a lot of different places, like on the dorsal fin, or like making up the lower jaw like it's some kind of butterfly proboscis that it could like unfold.
Yeah, just this toothy goatee.
Exactly, yeah. But as Will said, we do know now that it actually does sit straight up and down in the lower jaw. They've got sort of a really narrow lower jaw. And based on, first off, finding some fossils that actually have a little bit more of the skull, or rather the cartilage making up the cranium in there, plus the lack of wear on those teeth in the spiral, our best guess right now is that they were probably eating some kind of soft-bodied prey. And because of the way that that jaw would move, which is not up and down like our jaw, that jaw, the lower jaw would have sort of flipped open like a mailbox door.
Yeah.
So it's thought that they might have been using that jaw to kind of grab onto soft-bodied prey and either yoink it out of its shell or just hold on to it and kind of chop it up bit by bit.
Yeah. That jaw movement makes sense because then that does kind of spin the whirl as the jaw hinges that way. You'll get a bit of a buzzsaw action with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it means that as you're opening the mouth, you've got teeth in all directions towards inside the mouth, regardless of how open or closed the jaw is. Mm-hmm. There's always a little curve of teeth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like Will was saying, with the fact that they actually grow from basically the inside of that spiral out, they would have had differing levels of sharpness as you go further back in the mouth along that wall. So it's possible that they were using sort of the teeth towards the front of the mouth were better at snagging things, and towards the back of the mouth where they were a little newer and sharper, that might have been better for actually kind of cutting up prey. But regardless, with that tooth whorl and with sort of their narrow jaws, they wouldn't have been good at eating anything that had a heavy shell or was really sort of coarse to chew on.
Yeah. I'd heard of them, the idea that they were eating soft-bodied stuff, and just because they don't have any upper teeth if I remember right.
They do have sort of what we call like pavement teeth. So on the upper surface of the mouth, they would have had these little rounded sort of pebble-like teeth.
So a bit more like a stingray, like
Yes.
tooth battery sort of thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'd heard of them eating soft. I hadn't ever heard the idea of them pulling it out of the shell, but that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think of the snail eating snakes that are specialized at getting them out of the shell. Interesting.
I like the idea of it being an early iteration of a crab fork.
Yes.
Excellent. This is great. I get to sit here and watch you guys geek out about fish. This is great. This should be the format for fish episodes.
They get so weird.
I know so little about fish. It is this great.
I used to not know a lot, and then I worked in an aquarium for 3 years.
You got immersed, so to speak, in it. Well, fantastic. Yeah, the Helicoprion, the other thing I was going to mention, you mentioned that we've gotten more fossils of what the skull looks like.
Mm-hmm.
The earliest fossils of Helicoprion that made it famous, if I remember correctly, were just the tooth whorl.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just this isolated whorl of teeth, which is why, as Shay mentioned, there were all sorts of different hypotheses, like where on the body does this go? Now we have a better sense of that.
Well, especially because, like, at a glance, like, especially if you're new to fossils, if I just showed a picture of that really quick to people, I would not blame if they're like an ammonite shell.
Yeah, it looks like a shell.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there was one of the hypotheses that I remember reading from years ago was, did this like stick out of the face? Was it meant to be like a camouflage where you like blending in with ammonites so that you could sneak up on them and then eat them? Are there any other fish that have teeth remotely like that?
I mean, if we're talking about like true convergence, there's nothing that I know of.
Yeah.
But Helicoprion, again, was not actually a shark. It's in this other group known as eugenodonts. And a lot of eugenodonts do have weird dentition. Oftentimes, they'll have kind of two semicircular arcs of teeth in the lower jaw, but not a spiral tooth whorl. That's on a whole different level.
Yeah.
But it's not unprecedented within that group to have weird, sort of curved lower jaws with weird teeth.
Interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Quantum Robin, for submitting that question. That was a whole lot of fun. Thank you, Shay, for joining us to talk about eels and related fish.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was fun.
It is delightful.
Listeners, be sure to check out the blog post, which will be posted on our website with links and images and such for those of you who want to dive deeper. Thank you to all of the people who requested this episode. We hope you had a great time listening. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting us. Listeners, if there are further topics that you would like to hear us talk about, you can go to the topic request form on our website. You can find the link down in the episode description. If there's more fish you want to hear us talk about, maybe we'll bring Shay back and we'll talk about more fish. And as always, an extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Danielle the Bug Lover, Robert Mart, Sarah May, Bugs All the Way Down, and Melissa Barksdale. We release episodes every fortnight. More episodes coming up. Episode 200 coming up.
Yep.
Before that, at the end of the month that this episode is coming out in, will also be a Dragon Con.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody there who wants to come see us. Shay, one more time, thank you so much for returning to the podcast. This was tons of fun.
I agree. Good to be back after 7 long years.
Now you took a bit of a sabbatical.
Yeah, so in 2031, we'll invite you back on for episode. What is that'll be like 240 or something.
Yeah.
Nope, that's definitely not right.
No, not 200.
It'd be way more than that. Episode 700. We will have you back.
All right, I will mark it down in my calendar.
Yeah. We'll set it here. Listeners, let us know what fish you want us to talk about with Shay 7 years from now when we come back to it. All right, bye.
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 Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.